War is a part of our past, present, and future. For this reason, there will be a call for and a need for fighters and warriors in every generation and in every era. However, the motivations and convictions of these fighters may differ. Some may fight out of a desperation to defend their homes, some may fight purely for a paycheck, some may fight because it's what they were born to do based on their social class, some may fight because they're slaves in service to a master, and yet, some may just fight because they want to prove to everyone else that they are unrivaled and unmatched in combat. Indeed, some simply fight because they enjoy it, and that perfectly sums up the new hero in For Honor, Virtuosa. Welcome, my friends, to Heroes in History, where we take a look at all of For Honor's heroes and decide just who they're based on in history and whether or not they do their counterparts justice. Today, we're taking a look at the brand new hero in For Honor, the Virtuosa. I have had a lot to say about Virtuosa in the past few weeks since her release, but today we're putting all that aside just to analyze her character and determine who she's based on, so let's get into it. Let's first begin by talking about Virtuosa as she's given to us in the game. The Virtuosa are an all-female group of fighters considered outlanders despite having their roots in Ashfeld. Yeah, I've said my piece on that. Moving on. Inspired by the skills and ideals of Ilaria, these women have adorned the vestments of knights and performers while mastering the rapier. They don't fight for factions or for honor or for righteousness, but rather because they enjoy the thrill of victory. They take pleasure in besting their foes, for nothing for them is more cathartic than watching the hope of victory slip from the grasp of their adversary. Now, I've said a lot about the lore of these women, so I won't go too deep into it here, but I do want to say that their lore did in fact cause some conflict for me in terms of understanding who they were based on. To start, I'd like to talk about who I initially thought they were based on and why, and then I'll reveal the actual inspiration and why I changed my mind. So, let us begin. I should start by saying that, of all the gender-locked female heroes in game, Virtuosa honestly makes more sense than many that have come before, as female fencers are not an uncommon sight in the late medieval and Renaissance period. In fact, my first guess as to Virtuosa's inspiration was the infamous Jules d'Aubigny, one of the most famous female duelists in the history of France, as well as a renowned opera singer. Julie d'Aubigny was born in 1673 to Gaston d'Aubigny, who was responsible for training the court pages of King Louis XIV. As a result, Gaston's rearing of Julie involved not only a formal education usually reserved for men, but also intense fencing training in which she swiftly became well gifted by her adolescent years. At some point in her youth, Julie began putting her fencing and showmanship to higher pursuits, performing with her lover by giving fencing exhibitions as well as tavern singing and performances. What was striking was that while performing in these manners, Julie was often seen wearing traditional male attire. This was not in an attempt to disguise herself, but more than likely an attempt to shock value and show off some promiscuity. She did not hide her femininity or reject her gender, but rather used her masculine attire to further highlight her rebellious nature and to draw her attention from the French populace. And it worked. Around 1690, the Paris Opera hired Julie d'Aubigny, where she performed regularly for several years in their company. She began performing under the name Mademoiselle de Maupin. Now, some of you may know a little bit of French and know that mademoiselle is usually referred to a married woman, so is this because she was married? And she was married, but that's not why she got the name. It was tradition that women who played in the opera were given the title of mademoiselle whether they were married or not. However, what we know about her life during this time is speculatory and hard to pin down as truth or fiction. A lot of stories were circulating around about Mademoiselle de Maupin at this point. What we know is that she was well regarded as a singer and artist of the opera, and we also know she continued to duel against men and women on the regular. In fact, there's one very popular story that tells us that she dueled 3 men in one night because at a party she kissed a girl and they got very offended by that because even for the love-obsessed French, that was a little too promiscuous for them. However, not all of her actions were pure and noble. Before entering the opera, Julie had fallen in love with a young woman about her age, and the girl's parents tried to separate her from Julie by sending her to a convent. How did Julie respond? She proceeded to break into the convent, help her lover escape, and then set fire to the bedroom behind them to make it appear that she died. This affair only lasted a few months before the girl returned to her parents. Julie, in consequence, was subsequently charged with arson, kidnapping, and failure to appear before a tribunal. Further, to add to the hilarity of the situation, since she often dressed as a man, she was charged as a man as well. True gender equality right there. Julie, not wanting to be burned for her crimes, fled to Paris where she would begin her opera career. What this event in her early life certainly tells us is that Julie d'Aubigny was certainly a thrill-seeking and unapologetic rogue with a clear talent for both art, singing, dueling, and getting into trouble. Julie has, to this day, been hailed as a fascinating figure. She's looked upon as a strong woman of character, a bit of a rebel, and as well as a bisexual. Although, it should be emphasized that France, especially Paris, was not exactly without its sexual promiscuities and adventurousness. Julie had numerous partners of both genders throughout her life. However, her adventures would come to an end in 1705, when the death of her then lover, Madame la Marquise de Florensac, was, for reasons unknown, found dead. Well, Julie left the opera and retired to a convent as a result. Why she did this, we can't say. Some speculate she had a crisis of faith and sought redemption from the church. Some say she'd grown weary of the opera life and wanted a change of scenery. Others say she just wanted to start over and begin a new life altogether. Whatever the truth, we can't be sure, because Julie would tragically die 2 years later in 1707. Now, upon first picking up and playing Virtuosa, the character, I was certain that Julie d'Aubigny was the obvious reference. She's a female duelist wearing clothing typically intended for men in dress attire common in the 15th to 18th century, acting playful and cocky in the face of opposition, clearly trying to make statements to others, and even her name, Virtuosa, seemed a perfect reference as it ties into the musical nature, because a virtuosa, the female version of virtuoso, meaning someone who's exemplary in a field of art, typically music. Add on to that the singing done in the opening menu now, where we hear Virtuosa singing in the opening. I was certain this was Julie. I thought, who else could it be? And I'm still not entirely unconvinced that wasn't at least a partial influence. But the truth is, there is a problem with her being based on Julie d'Aubigny. Firstly, Virtuosa are Italian, not French. And this had to be a deliberate choice by the developers. If they were basing her on Julie, why not just make her French? For a company with plenty of French speakers, it couldn't have been hard to find voice actors, and it would have been a perfect excuse to do so. But they deliberately chose Italian. Further, some of the designers of Virtuosa armor are still conducive to a period of the Renaissance well before Julie's era. So with all that in mind, is there a possible other explanation? Is there someone else the Virtuosa are based on? I believe that while Julie d'Aubigny was likely an inspiration for the personality and flair of Virtuosa, I believe the warrior themselves were largely inspired by the Italian mercenaries of the Italian wars during the Renaissance, or perhaps more precisely, the military leaders of that era known as the Condottieri. During the Middle Ages, Italy was not a unified country, but rather a divided series of city-states and provinces. Many of the larger and richer territories like Milan, Venice, and Florence were made rich off their trade with the Levant, but they suffered from a gross lack of strong central military capability. This was due to two factors. First, while they had an abundance of money, they lacked the experienced manpower because most of their able-bodied men were needed for essential jobs like agriculture, public works, and crafts. Second, local militias were often biased when it came to factional disputes within urban areas, so when war was imminent, it was hard to know how reliable a city militia could be. In order to address these issues, these cities hired foreign administrators to oversee and deal with these affairs in an impartial manner. But these administrators needed armies of their own, and thus enter the Condottieri. The word means contractor, and though it referred to captains of mercenary companies, it came to be a general term for all mercenaries active during the Middle Ages to Renaissance period. Mercenaries were nothing new in Italy, of course. They'd existed for many years before, as far back as the 9th century, but they had largely been from foreign lands, such as Germany, England, France, and Switzerland. However, these foreign forces were still referred to as condottieri because the term merely referred to those who took mercenary contracts, not whether they were homeland Italians. These condottieri were largely veterans of the Crusades or the 30 Years' War, going to Italy to seek their fortune. The most famous and successful of these foreign condottieri was John Hawkwood, an English longbowman of Edward III during the 30 Years' War, who traveled with the White Company to Italy in 1356. Hawkwood was not just a strong warrior, but he began to alter the manner in which wars were waged, which would also alter the very manner in which condottieri were seen. You see, many condottieri realized that merely throwing armed men at each other in skirmishes and pitched battles was a waste of manpower, resources, and could often end disastrously. Instead, many condottieri, including Hawkwood, realized that there was an art to war, a way to fight an enemy's way of making war rather than fighting an enemy directly. This became a common attribute affiliated to many of the more successful condottieri, and we will talk more about that later. However, this didn't mean that the condottieri didn't relish combat. In one famous instance, a friar said to Hawkwood, "May God give you peace," to which Hawkwood was said to have answered, "Don't you know I'm a warrior? Peace would ruin me." However, it would be from under Hawkwood's shadow that many other and famous mercenaries would emerge, one being Albericio de Barbiano. He became dissuaded by some of the more destructive and horrific massacres he'd been a part of, namely the Cesena bloodbath, which he and many others felt had been a step too far. He left Hawkwood and formed his own company known as the Compagnia di San Giorgio, the Company of St. George, if you wanted to know more. This company was immensely successful, and thanks to his many successes, this led to the rise of more and more Italian Condottieri. The Italians preferred to hire their own countrymen, as they spoke the same language and often could be tied to known or recognized families or political networks, but this didn't make them more reliable. The politics of Italy were rich with betrayal and backstabbing, especially in the Renaissance. Many condottieri would end up using the necessity of their presence to their own advantage, demanding higher wages than was likely necessary, because they knew they could easily go elsewhere if the buyer didn't relent. Further, many would begin finding seats in politics, sometimes even becoming potential rivals to the very ones who hired them in the first place. However, this also came with a certain degree of professionalism not seen in Italian warfare before. Firstly, the Italian condottieri were not like knights of old who fought for honor, glory, and station. These men fought for money and plunder, and as a result, glorious death in battle was not something they were keen on. This meant that vicious charges into the enemy line were highly unpopular, meaning that new tactics were needed. To aid in this, they studied old Roman tactical manuals and learned techniques and tactics to better exploit and defeat enemies without losing good men. Further, since they were all countrymen, it was common that different condottieri captains might know each other. This meant that they were rarely bloodthirsty hostilities, and sometimes even mutual respect was shown between two warring condottieri groups. This led to a very bizarre form of combat where the two sides would make a lot of noise, shout, insult, and make complex and very fancy maneuvers, but once one side realized they were outflanked or outmaneuvered, they usually surrendered and the two sides would meet and come to amicable terms. This infuriated the Italian nobles who hired them, but they couldn't exactly stop them or force them to kill each other. As long as the contract was sound, they could engage however they saw fit. Now, the condottieri saw the peak of their influence in the 15th century. At this time, most of the mercenaries were Italian, and many of their leaders were landless nobility or from decaying lineages who lost their hereditary land. Therefore, they were accustomed to being leaders, were not intimidated by displays of wealth and power, and were gifted at negotiation. Becoming a mercenary must have seemed like a very enticing prospect for young Italian noble sons who had no station or chance of inheritance. Or perhaps it was a good option for young and penniless upstarts who wanted to seek riches and new prospects. The life of a condottieri was not pretty, but it was potentially lucrative. This outlook on mercenary life, however, was not shared by everyone. Niccolò Machiavelli, one of the most famous political philosophers of the time, had a bitter view of the mercenaries. According to historian Hans Dulbruck, quote, "The great historians of the Renaissance, Machiavelli, Guicciardini, and Jovius, were all agreed in stating that the condottieri waged war simply as a game and not in bloody earnest." Why was this? Largely because it meant that the longer the wars were drawn out, the more money they could wring out of their employers. However, despite Machiavelli's cynical outlook on the condottieri, many modern historians espouse he was being somewhat unfair. While it is true that in certain engagements, like the Battle of Anghiari of 1440, only one knight was reported as killed, it is highly possible that many hundreds of infantry may have been killed. What is sure, however, is that both sides of the conflict had a mutual understanding not to be bloodthirsty or needlessly destructive. In most cases, the condottieri only cared about fulfilling the wishes of their employers. If that could be done without killing, so be it. But that didn't mean brutal battles never happened, such as the Battle of Parabiago, where both sides suffered immense losses. Sadly, the era of the condottieri would start to fade during the 16th century, as they were facing more and more foreign enemies of higher caliber and stock, such as the Landsknecht and the Swiss. The condottieri's sense of fair play was not shared by their foreign invaders, and though they would certainly win some notable victories, they were soon outclassed and outgunned. The heavy cavalry of the condottieri that they were so fond of was rendered obsolete by the advent of pikemen like the Swiss were known for, and as muskets became more common, the necessity of well-armed infantry became far more important. While the condottieri did use infantry, they never used them to their full extent or potential. In a sense, the condottieri had simply had it too good for too long. Without any real vicious rivals or enemies to force them to innovate, grow, or adapt, and also allowing themselves to wallow in the chance of political power and nobility, the condottieri were swiftly and mercilessly outpaced by the military sciences, tactics, and technology of the other European countries who had been embroiled in far more grueling and demanding campaigns and were forced to innovate and grow. But the condottieri would leave their mark on Italian history. Many would found noble houses, and they would become the subject of many of the Renaissance's greatest artists and chronicles, such as the Sforza family. And of course, for all you Assassin's Creed fans, how could you forget your favorite mercenary? Yeah, guys, you know I gotta mention Bartolomeo de Liviano.
I'll kill you if you don't.
He was a real condottieri with an impressive record of his own, so I had to mention him. Now that I've bored you to tears with this long history on the Italian mercenaries, how does Virtuosa relate? Well, leaving aside the obvious language similarity, there's a few other points of reference. The overall aesthetic of the Virtuosa fits, as she seems to have various outfits that at least use partial plate armor, usually consisting of a metal breastplate and possibly a helmet. Even then, the majority of her armor appears very ornate, which was not uncommon in the Renaissance period. Then there's her playful attitude. Virtuosa treats her battles like a game, a chance to prove her superiority through her unique style of fighting. And was it not Machiavelli himself who claimed the Condottieri were simply making war into a game rather than anything meaningful? Let me put it this way. The Virtuosa does not fight for factions, they don't fight for a higher calling, they don't fight for glory or for God or for land. They fight because they see the chance to be the best. They fight because it's fun. The Condottieri, though, certainly demonstrating professionalism, also demonstrated a battlefield ideology that wasn't quite in line with what we traditionally associate with at the time. They weren't necessarily fighting for patriotism, as they fought their own countrymen. They weren't fighting for God and glory, as they saw no value in dying for anything. In truth, many fought for the money and because it was a chance to rise above their station. Taking that and considering the origins of Ilaria herself, an orphan with no station, land, or title, she chose to be a fighter because it was a way out of her impoverished lifestyle. Likewise, many condottieri were nobles or princes who knew they would not inherit anything, or they were simply without prospects that they would fall back on. Now, the real issue with the condottieri reference we see is primarily the rapier, which was not a commonly used weapon in war at the time. In fact, the rapier wouldn't start to take off in Italy until the early to mid-16th century, right when the condottieri were starting to decline. There are various reasons for this, much of which comes down to the fundamental reliance on rapiers as a superior duelist weapon, the favoring of pikemen and musketeers over sword-wielding linemen, and then the condottieri, ironically for Virtuosa, were still married to an archaic form of militarism that favored strong, heavy cavalry and weaker infantry. The condottieri were very fond of heavy night cavalry to decimate enemy lines. By the time this was made obsolete, the condottieri were fading, and it was in this time that rapiers, which would make for a convenient sidearm, became more popular. Now, before anyone comes at me saying, "What about the fact that the Virtuosa's a girl, Raven? Don't you know girls never fought in the Italian wars and girls are just icky?" Well, while you're correct that we have very few records of any condottieri females, two things to bear in mind. The first is that the rapier, as I said, is an ideal weapon for women. Lighter in weight than most other weapons of the time, easy to master and use, and not cumbersome to carry around. The second thing to keep in mind is that we do have historical documentation of women dueling with rapiers, such as Julie D'Aubigny, who I talked about earlier, and she is not an isolated case. One other that might surprise you is Caterina Sforza. Yes, that Caterina Sforza.
Welcome home.
And it may shock you to know, she is from the Sforza family, which was founded by a condottieri. A little bit of trivia for you there. And with that, I think we can finally close out this Heroes in History. Though I think we all have opinions on Virtuosa, whether bad or good, whether we think she's OP, annoying, or enjoyable, I think we can all agree that this hero has changed the face of For Honor forever. Not unlike her historical counterparts did in Italy centuries ago. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.